So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to the first recording that I'm doing after getting back from yet another trip away for work. And we make a return to the east of Middle-earth today and all of the trappings of the evil men that reside there, with Rhun being at their head as per usual and several of their allies here as well. Interesting and slightly strange deployment zones on this one because they can't start within the settlement, but I'm sure there'll be a grace period to allow them within. Anyway, you can see there's a varying amount of architecture, including the standard Eastern Medieval 2 tile set, a few of the Sauron statues as well that have been in the game for a while, and also some of the new Haradrim-inspired buildings as well, which WK did make also. So you can see there's a bit of a mixture of things going on with this standard cityscape style map. Once more, there's some more open areas in this first layer there. There is then a pretty defensible set of choke points across these river crossings, and finally a good area to make final stands up here in the highest bits of terrain that the map has to offer. We'll see how the defenders choose to set up here. The rivers will probably be their best bet of narrowing the map suitably so that they're probably lower quality armies, considering it is a 4v4 defence today, are going to need to try and equalise the quality a little bit by trying to utilise ranged units and the like, as is usually the way. But we'll start off with the attacking armies as we usually do, starting with Y2K86 over here, who's playing as Dol Amroth. Obviously, perhaps not too surprising to see Dol Amroth take to the field against the likes of Rhun and Harad, given their geographical position. It'll be a good opportunity as well to see Dol Amroth's infantry in action once more for the most part. Dol Amroth don't have quite the same level of variation or indeed high-end quality that their overlords in Gondor perhaps do have outside of their heavy swordsmen, but they still have very functional units. And units like the Dol Amroth men-at-arms here do have that very nice shield value as well, though not quite as numerous as their Gondor infantry equivalent, which is worth bearing in mind, and that is one of the main upgrades that this kind of unit has had from the Western Kingdoms of Men. So that is not something that Dol Amroth are able to indulge in quite so much. They do still have a bit of a unit size buff here, but not quite to the same extent. Dol Amroth halberdiers are going to be an interesting one. Many of the eastern factions do have decent armour values, not quite so much as their western counterparts, but it's going to be one of those interesting exchanges here, especially with Rhun, because Rhun have got very equivalent halberdiers in the Loke Gamp Rim. But the halberdiers mostly will be here as the anchor to the infantry just in front of them. It's interesting that they've decided not to go for the pikes, but go for the slightly more damaging, and obviously with the armour piercing that the halberdiers do have. Perhaps because many of the Eastern men don't have access to pikes of their own, they're willing to take that toe-to-toe engagement. Interesting to see if that pays off for Dol Amroth here. We have the Dol Amroth spearmen as well, obviously the equivalent of the line infantry that we've just seen, but with all of the advantages and disadvantages that come with this weapon type. Lower base damage, especially with the spear malice in tow, but better defensively and faster attacks, which is what causes that better defensive nature. We'll see again how well they can perform, especially given the fact that many of these evil men factions that they're going to be facing off against do have access to armour piercing, and that is one of the main ways in which especially the basic Dol Amroth units keep themselves alive. Just in behind we have the Talon Knights, previously the dismounted Knights of the Silver Swan. They've been combined really with the Black Swan Renegades to form this kind of lower bodyguard tier unit, I suppose. In this, obviously they're still going to be very good as mace men, and as a more defensive armour piercing infantry unit they are very useful, especially considering outside of the halberds Dol Amroth don't really have any other outright armour piercing options. It is interesting they've decided to go with them, though, considering they are pretty expensive for what they are. Parathil Horse Archers. This is a map, even within the settlement, with some more open spaces, so it is very possible that a unit like this could really pay dividends as the battle goes on, but we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, it is they are pretty well armoured for Horse Archers as well, so that does give them a bit more longevity compared to many. Belfast Marines, Javelins in a siege kind of situation like this are always going to have their uses. Most of the factions they're facing off against are perhaps more comfortable with throwing projectiles, but the Belfast Marines are pretty much dead centre in terms of quality. They're not overly numerous like many of the Orcish ones, they're not overly devastating like some of the high-end Javelin options are, but they sort of cut a nice middle ground really. And they do have some heavy swordsmen as well. We have the Parathil Champions, I hesitate to say basic because they're not really. they are a higher tier unit, and they should do very well against many of the forces they're facing off against. But of course, the Haven Guard of Athalond over here are going to be the best unit that Dol Amroth can field on foot, and they are one of the best units in class as well. Maybe not the very best heavy swordsman, but pretty damn close, and that's a fine feather in their cap. Now then, we have Hertumihai playing as Gondor, so Gondor we've already mentioned a little bit about them already. The Gondor Spearmen here with the armour upgrades, that is one thing that Gondor do have over many factions really. They have plentiful armour upgrades, fairly cheap as well. You can get 2 for the price that many factions would pay for 1, and that does make a big difference to their defensive attributes, though it is worth saying as well that many of the defensive factions today will have access to that armour piercing, so it won't be quite so useful as it would otherwise be. But it is still one of the main things that Gondor will be looking to take advantage of in a situation like this. The Gondor infantry, one of the main units which we have seen to have that unit increase size, so 203 per unit is a big deal. It does mean that they can act as that numerous and very metallic front line as well when they've got all their armour upgrades here. Again, armour piercing will counteract them a bit, but their higher numbers and just their ability to absorb punishment from afar as well is going to be very useful here in this sort of situation when they're going to be trying to use superior quality and numbers potentially to force their way through the settlement. Excuse me. Standard Gondor archers. Gondor in general should be fairly comfortable against most of the defending factions in terms of skirmish fights, depending on how much they've decided to invest into it. Regular Gondor archers without the armour upgrade are still going to be good trading with other forces because they're not particularly expensive, but they're not going to be quite so domineering as some of Gondor's other options in this regard. And this really is going to be the main example of such. The fully upgraded veterans of Osgiliath, very high armour values, shielded. They cannot be routed either, so you can't really use fire arrows or poison arrows to try and break them if they've already taken a lot of damage. They will stand and fight to the bitter end. A very useful unit for Gondor to have if they intend to try and bully other factions from afar, and seeing as the settlement is a little more open in some areas, this is something Gondor can try and engage in. Pelagia Marines are very similar to the Belfast Marines we've already seen. Just in behind them we also have the Citadel Guard, another throwing projectile option that Gondor now have, though limited ammunition. They are still first and foremost a high-end unit of spears, but the extra punch that they now have from their javelins does give them another dimension which the defenders will have to be on the lookout for. And then we have the pseudo and actual polearms in the Guards of Osgiliath in behind, pikes. Like I said, the extra range will be useful against the largely pikeless forces they're going to be going up against. And then Fountain Guard on either side, which do technically have a polearm, and it does come with anti-cavalry bonuses and the like. However, they do wield it more aggressively now in the fashion that a two-handed axe would be wielded, so they don't have the same defensive attributes now. Albeit the Nimlothian Honor Guard do have the defensive prowess of spears. They're now in a slightly more defensive shape than they were when we first saw this new redesign. But they still have that armour piercing, which gives them that aggressive edge. Moving on to another Gondorian army as well, Tommy the Rage Quitter. We've got some standard Gondor archers, but this time they do have the full armour upgrade, so Gondor will be fielding between them a pretty savage skirmishing force, especially with 2 units of veterans of Osgiliath. The gold level armour upgrade is not present here. I believe this is the silver level armour upgrade, so just 1 shy, but that will still be more than enough really against most other forces to be able to deal with them effectively. Again, some more armour piercing in the Axemen of Lasarnak, an aggressive unit, good base damage as well. How efficient will they be against this kind of opposition? We shall have to wait and see. Several units of Gondor infantry are here also. Fountain Guard, once more that aggressive stance that they now take up. More Citadel Guard, more Pelagia Marines. We have more Nimlothian Honor Guard as well, so largely the same, but he does have a unit of the Vanguard of King Elisar, which stand out a lot really in the Gondor roster given their much darker colour scheme. But another unit of heavy swordsmen here, which is going to be interesting to see how they compare to the Haven Guard. And last but by no means least, it's the first time we've seen Numenor in quite a while actually. I think this might be the first time actually we're seeing Numenor in this version of the test build, commanded by T.S. Niehoff. Numenorian cohort, of course. Numenor, I think the reason we haven't seen a great deal of Numenor is because largely outside of the overall meta changes that the patch has undergone, Numenor are pretty much unchanged in terms of the layout of their faction and what they have available to them and what they're good at. Nothing's really changed, and the Numenorian cohort fairly limited in number, but obviously very high quality. We know what they're all about, capable of dishing out a hefty amount of damage for the class of unit that they are as well. Belagia Pikeman, or Balagai Pikeman I should say. Good anchor, reasonably cheap, especially considering Numenor's roster is pretty expensive and not all that big, so you have to take what victories you can when it comes to cheaper units, and the Balagai Pikemen do allow them to do that. Narun Aru Royal Guard here as well, with the gold accents and the blue colour scheme. Very good heavy archer from afar. One of the few perhaps to be able to challenge the veterans of Osgiliath we've already seen in terms of very heavy archers that are good at skirmishing back and forth with the enemy. I don't know how the Numenorian steel bows have changed since the last version of the game, but I would assume that it's still a case of very limited ammunition but very high damage armor piercing projectiles. So again, it's going to be a case of using them sparingly and at the right moment. Seafarers of Nindamos offer the javelin line infantry, well, medium line infantry hybrid that they always were. So again, kind of similar actually to the role that the Citadel Guard are going to be playing, albeit the Citadel Guard are a higher tier option in that regard. We've got Balagai archers as well, several units of them including some spears, so going for a few more of the rank and file here, Numenor, rather than just going all out in terms of quality, though of course we do have the Pharazim Swordmasters who have had a slight change to their profile as well, some more black accents put onto their armour, which is quite nice and appealing. Several units of the Numenorian Shield Guard as well, fantastic unit of spears again, damaging. And we have the Lords of Anadun, which again, cavalry with javelins now, that's an interesting change. So this is possibly the most significant change Numenor have undergone. The cavalry was always pretty good, but perhaps pretty dull in what it offered. Obviously Numenorians weren't really known for their cavalry, but having Javcav that is also very, very good in melee against other cavalry, it gives them that anti-cavalry cavalry option, which then potentially will allow their infantry to do their thing. Moving on then to the defenders, starting off with those fighting on home turf. We have Dabo fighting as Rhun today, the Carmel's chosen, a fine unit of bodyguard infantry. There are a few units we've already seen from the attackers that will be able to outdo them, especially the more aggressive ones. But in terms of keeping defensive shape, and Rhun do have other damaging options, they're a very dependable unit at the high end. Of course, the Flagrim are here. Considering their opposition, the Flagrim are always going to be one of the things that Rhun would lean on quite heavily. That armor piercing is always going to be useful. In terms of outright quality, they will struggle a little bit against some of the high tier, particularly the Numenorian units, but overall their quality is high enough to the point where they're at least even with much of what Gondor and Dol Amroth have, and the armor piercing perhaps gives them a bit more of an edge. Gamprim, we already briefly mentioned, a fine unit of halberdiers in their own right, though the pikes that the attackers have will be able to outrange them, and I think actually the Dol Amroth halberdiers may be of slightly higher quality than them just because of the armor values, though how much of a difference that actually makes is debatable. A couple of units of Scion Rim, the more defensive option, of course, these heavy spears, very, very nice. We have the Balkoth tribesmen here in force, also defending javelins, always going to be useful if you can find a good place for them. We'll see where the defenders choose to set up within their settlement. Carmel's shadow bows here as well, looks like 2 units of them. They're very high damage, of course, not great in a skirmish fight, which may be a little bit of a concern given the rosters that the attackers have decided to roll with here, but if they can use them correctly, if they can target the right forces down with them, especially the unshielded units that the attackers have, which are pretty much their most dangerous units, that could be the way to go. Though of course the crossbows are also always the thing which Rhun have, which are going to be quite worthy of fear. They don't have the best defensive stats among the crossbows in the game, even with the armour upgrade they've been furnished with here, but we've seen crossbows of all stripes be effective in the past. Another unit of Gamprim, and the Carmel's Immortals here, which in terms of an infantry unit for its tier in melee, they're pretty impressive. Good defence, good staying power as well, but the lack of a shield is a bit of a problem when it comes to getting them shot up with arrows, but we shall see. Moving on to Khand, played by Medexa, we have the Chieftain's Vanguard here. Very fine units of horse archers indeed, and we mentioned the Parathor horse archers have got good armour, but overall in terms of defensive stats, the Chieftain's Vanguard may be the best off in terms of horse archers that the game has to offer. You don't really associate horse archers with being terribly, having a terrible amount of staying power, mind you. It'll be interesting to see how they get on, considering the strength of the cavalry that the attackers have brought. Nomadic archers are here. I mean, can hang around with quite a few of the skirmishing factions that the game has to offer, though I would suggest Gondor will overpower them if it does come down to it, but we'll see how much of an advantage the defensive terrain gives to the defenders here. Nomadic Marauders, cheap javelins, of course, we've seen them be effective so many times before. Nerad Footmen give them a similar armor-piercing damage spike on their front line to what Rhun enjoy with the Flag Rim. The Flag Rim possibly a little bit more well-rounded, but the Nerad Footmen do have a better shield value, so swings and roundabouts, I suppose. Nomadic Axemen are in here as well, bit of armor-piercing bite, which is always nice. We've got some Nerad Halberdiers in here also, similar sort of advantages and disadvantages to the Gamp Rim. Khand and Rhun do have many similarities with the core of their units, but in the higher tier, of course, Khand rely on individual units of Brotherhood units to give them their quality spikes, whereas Rhun, once again, have several examples of individual units like the Scion Rim to bolster their defence. But yeah, plenty of armor piercing there. We'll see how they get on. Moving on to Adin Men here, who's playing as Harad. Kind of difficult to see what he has. I mean, he definitely has the Demons of the Desert, which recently we've seen be very effective on the Temple of Melkor. We'll see if that's the case once again. Southron Warband are here also. Harad in particular actually lean very heavily on their armor piercing at range and in melee, and it's one of the things they will need to do, because they certainly can't hang around defensively with the attackers today, but they can out damage them, and it's not a case of trying to outlast them, it's a case of just trying to bowl them over, I think, as Harad, which is weird considering they're the defenders, but that is the situation as it stands. Serpent Archers with the poison projectiles. We have some more of the Serpent Guard as well. The Trollmen are undoubtedly present. I mean, one thing that is very clear are the Mumakil here, who have a bit of a new model as well, which is interesting to see. Obviously, the old Mumakil model is one of those which had been in the game for a long time. One of those survivors from the originals, really, but no longer the case. The Mumakil are here, 3 of them. We'll see how well they do as well, because this is a class of unit which has been vastly increased in terms of its effectiveness. In the previous version of the game, of course, monstrous units were very underwhelming. We've seen from the Mordor Beasts of Gorgoroth that's no longer the case, and the Mumakil are even better than them, so let's see how they get on. And last but not least, we do have Mordor, played by the Womb Raider here, the overlords of all, going to be kind of heading up defence. I guess Rhun are de facto in command because it is their home, but Mordor here making sure that their allegiances don't stray. Orc Fodder, this is a very numerous Mordor army actually, with Orc Fodder, Orc Maulers, Uruk Infantry, Uruk Halberds making up the vast majority of it, which I like to see because the budget is going to be a little bit more restricted for the defenders here in a 4v4, so you are going to need to rely on other things. I mean, having these numbers does mean that the attackers are going to have to be quite careful, especially when it comes to high quality armies like Numenor. If they get trapped in a choke point for too long, just through sheer numbers they won't have the staying power to hang around with Mordor if they have this kind of army, so it does put the ball into the attacker's court somewhat. We've got some Troll Drummers in here. Well, I say that actually, I think they're just the officers of those units, but it looks like a unit of Troll Drummers. We've seen the Olag High be very effective in this version of the game as well. Uruk Chieftains, we've got some Morgul Chosen here, very similar to all the heavy spears we've mentioned previously in this particular battle. Ardenaim Shadow Bows, we have more armor-piercing archers in the Temple Guard, though they don't have the ammunition deficiencies that the steel bows do. And then we also have some Orc Javelins as well, always an efficient pick. Sauron's Will are also hidden, which is interesting. So some quality, a lot of the rank and file though. Obviously I'm going to be making a cut here because I do believe the defenders will be allowed to get into an initial defensive position, and then the attackers will sweep down from the hills, and we'll see how they go about tackling this settlement, which, like the other cityscapes we've seen, is a little bit of a puzzle. It's not quite a uniform settlement. There's a lot of lumps and bumps to it, which so far in this kind of settlement the attackers have actually been able to use to their advantage, but we'll see if the defenders can take good advantage of them at this time around. But yes, I'll make a cut and we'll rejoin when the battle is about to begin. So I think we shall rejoin here as the jaws start to close, and perhaps unsurprisingly we are going to be seeing the setup of some regular units with some archers in behind, although I will say this initial defence is going to be perhaps slightly susceptible to the way that the Gondorians appear to be stacking up here. The Carmel's Immortals won't do too well even under the most basic arrow fire that Gondor can muster, and mostly Rhun going to be guarding these 2 choke points as well. Dol Amroth and Gondor going to be putting pressure on them, so there is going to be a real necessity really for Khand and Medexa to come to Dabo's aid if they are to be successful over on this side of the battlefield. The bridge does do the defenders a few favours. I'll be interested to see if Tommy decides to try and use it, just because of the issues with trying to utilise bridges as the South Run archers begin to fire. So we're going to be seeing the trading back and forth of archers here. South Run archers, however, certainly not a match for the far tankier veterans of Osgiliath. The veterans, of course, built for this very purpose. The Marksman of Caer Andros, of course, have been folded into the regular Gondor archers somewhat, so that is worth bearing in mind that Gondor perhaps don't have quite the same level of options as they used to when it comes to their heaviest archers. Meanwhile, the Moon Raider coming outside of the walls here with the Ardenheim Shadowbows, a little bit of a counter-attack perhaps, given the highly stretched nature of T.S. Niehoff's advance with his Numenor army, and considering it is Belagaya pikemen that are out there, these are easy kills for some of these archers. I mean, 2 units of Ardenheim Shadowbows, also the Temple Guard going to be firing at the Lords of Anadune on the way forwards. Going to be a real litmus test of how powerful those javelins can be, but they don't have enough of them really. They're not a big enough cavalry unit to swiftly deal with the Shadowbows. This is a real risk as well, because they do run the risk now of being surrounded by Olag High. Cavalry that wield lances can be very good against trolls off the charge, but being involved in sustained melee with them is very bad, even for what is clearly a very high tier unit of cavalry like the Lords. Quite a few kills being inflicted on these units now though with the Numenorian steel bows. Is there going to be a better opportunity to use the steel bows? Possibly not. Several of the trolls already bloodied. The Olag High are the strongest of their kind, but if they are whittled down a little bit in terms of their effectiveness before the battle even begins, perhaps that can mitigate their effectiveness somewhat, especially given the quality of Numenor's infantry. Perhaps the Olag High won't be quite so impressive this time out if this damage can continue. The Lords of Anadune have also not really taken too many losses. In fact, I would say Numenor probably have had the better end of this engagement, considering both sides have lost some very high tier units, with several Temple Guard also being killed off. Although that's probably not great for Numenor, as much as their morale may not be the most fragile thing in the world. You still don't want to lose your general this early if you can help it. Some of the Olag High dying, but maybe you could make the argument, will the Lords be useful for anything else? Maybe helping to try and take the edge off the Muma kill, but even then that's going to be questionable. Veterans of Osgiliath still going to be trading back and forth with the wooden wicker clad Southrons, but it's never really going to be the sort of duel that goes Harad's way, although in melee of course it's always been one of those most intriguing of matchups. Harad and Gondor both strong against what the other is weak at. Gondor Spearmen marching into place. The Carmel's Immortals should actually do fairly well. The armour would keep the Gondor Spearmen alive for a long time though, and the addition of the Gamp Rim should also flick this fight in favour of the men in gold, primarily gold. Here, meanwhile, these strong crossmen. So Gondor and Old Amroth starting out with more of an infantry-focused advance to just sort of test the waters. Neither side too interested in committing too much of their ranged resources too early. Dol Amroth Man-at-Arms victory seems certain for them. Carmel's Immortals struggling a little bit here. Perhaps understandably, Dol Amroth Man-at-Arms have those defensive attributes, but also don't have to deal with the Spear Malice like the Gondorians are in the other choke point. Y2K over here and his Gondorian counterpart, Hatunahai, don't need either to divide their attentions between multiple choke points or advance into a position which is a little bit wider like maybe their allies have to, so concentration of force might be their friend here. Paratal Horse Archers not able to utilise themselves as a particularly mobile force at the moment, but they are able to arc their shots, primarily going after the Gamp Rim, I believe, which is very understandable. Several of them falling away with immediate effect. Meanwhile, Gondor are starting to struggle a little bit on this front line. You can see it bowing inwards. It still says that victory seems certain for them, but as more time passes, surely the Gamp Rim will start to assert themselves in this particular fight. you would assume. Gondor infantry, however, may give them some relief. I don't know if the Pelargian Marines are going to be able to get the arc of fire that they may want in order to be super effective over here. On the advance as well, Scion Rim, so the cogs of the battle turn as they will. Meanwhile, Cand being pressurised on foot by Tommy, of course, with the bridge and this more standard angle of attack that he can engage in, although Medexa probably wasn't as prepared for this. Narad Footman not blocking off the entire choke point, so there is the danger that Gondor could flood forward, though with Brotherhood of the Spear supporting archers and javelins, maybe the crossfire is what Medexa was going for, and already the Gondorians starting to waver a little bit in their convictions. Gondor archers just in behind. Pelargian Marines are actually routing and broken, so maybe Gondor needs something with a little bit more oomph to be committed forward. Saffron Warband pushing the veterans of Osgiliath back across the bridge. The Gondor infantry may yet follow through. In fact, Harad haven't done too badly here. You can see there's just as many Gondorians scattered and strewn from these initial engagements as there are from them, and then just adding in the Gondorians as well. I mean, perhaps when they're under this much range pressure, I don't know if the Axemen of Lasarnak would necessarily be the answer, but forward come the Mumakil. This could be absolutely devastating for Gondor, even if they don't get tons and tons of kills. Yeah, they rout, and the panic induced by Mumakil has always been one of their better weapons, even when they weren't quite so effective. They are still massive targets, however, so many of those javelins will be hitting their mark, so this is where I think it is the Citadel Guard will be doing their thing, but that's a lot of routing. Many of them probably will come back, but it will mean that Tommy will have to reset this particular assault. Now, meanwhile, there's this fight going on. I mean, Numenor, as I mentioned, it's going to be a bit of an awkward fight for Numenor, because they're going to need to not hang around and take this amount of damage from Mordor, because they simply don't have the numbers, as you would expect, even with Belagire and Nindamos auxiliaries as they have. They don't have the army size to really be getting involved in a game of tug of war with the very numerous Mordor army that faces them. Ardenheim shadow bows are taking hits. Steel bows, several units of cohort back there as well. They can't bring forward their pikes too close to this defensive position too early either, so they can't anchor themselves too easily with the Mordor Rangers still in close attendance. We'll see how Numenor get on, but I do think perhaps elsewhere on the battlefield is where they'll be hoping to make gains before they can really deploy their quality. Meanwhile, Gondor infantry moving forward, I mean, as much as the Warband do have that armour piercing, their melee stats are still such that the Gondor infantry without support would still be fairly easily able to beat them, but upgraded dismounted Serpent Guard, far more of an equivalent kind of unit. Maybe not as savvy defensively, but maybe a little bit more up for the challenge in terms of their own ability to deal damage with those scimitars of theirs. All Gondorians crossing the bridge, Gondor infantry. Gondor archers now trying to get into place to support Southron archers, actually feeling confident enough to not simply continuously fire. They aren't now the focus of the Gondorian archers, they can pick and choose their targets a little bit more. Meanwhile, Nomadic Axemen moving forward to shore things up. This has probably been the bloodiest fight on the field so far. Both the Gondorians and Cand have taken a pretty hefty amount of losses. Gondor sending forward more and more quality now as well. Citadel Guard in melee, the sort of things which may ward off another flying visit from the Mumakil, given their own abilities at dealing with such things. Well, Brotherhood of the Shadows in a very nice position. So these initial choke points, as much as the map seems a little bit more open in behind these initial defensive positions, the attackers haven't been able to get into a position where they can potentially exploit that. The defenders doing a good job so far of holding on to the initial defensive strong points. And so far Gondor, both Gondor armies have been the ones to suffer from a loss of morale in these earlier stages in proceedings. Rhun's front line still looking pretty solid, can support, I mean, some losses being inflicted on the Brotherhood of the Shadows, but Gondor struggling in the face of their throwing daggers. Braukoff tribesmen doing the same thing to Dol Amroth over here. Parathor champions did move forward, but not a huge amount of progress has been made by Dol Amroth either. The initial line of Carmel's Immortals still stands, and the more of those javelins that find their mark, the more unlikely a positive result for Dol Amroth in the near future becomes. Flagrim in behind as well, so that means it's very likely Dol Amroth's spearmen probably won't be the answer to this particular puzzle either. It's difficult, isn't it? Because in order to try and make progress you would need a bit of extra quality. Maybe something like the Talon Knights could be useful for that, but if you do send those forward, more tribesmen will probably take up position over there, or even the crossbows, and finish them off. But something needs to give here, because I don't think the attackers can simply rely on them having a little bit of extra quality, in places a few extra numbers. I don't think that either of those two advantages is significant enough for them to try and play that way, as the attackers often can. This is not a 5v3. Gondor trying to put more pressure on once again over here. Gondor Spearmen, and the Guards of Osgiliath is an interesting commitment of units. That will make life a little bit more difficult for Rhun in terms of trying to deploy that armour-piercing damage, which has served them well so far. Flagrim adding to the Gamprim on this particular choke point. Javelins coming in trying to go after the Guards of Osgiliath. Gondor archers maybe trying to do the business as well. Gamprim. I mean, Darrow's committed a lot of his army so far, so perhaps it is committing to all of the outer chokes. Here. Citadel Guard and Gondor infantry struggling. The arrival of Nurad halberds meaning canned, still looking fairly comfortable, but Gondor having to split their attentions over here. Southron archers still doing their thing. Can Gondor start making progress again? The arrival of more warband, dismounted Serpent Guard have taken losses in this fight, but there were more Haradrim up here in the first place, and the numbers advantage has told. Harad's army still holds a line up here as well, so Gondor struggling a little bit more to make an impression over here, but Tommy's army still does have more to give. As more Gondor infantry floods forth. Right over here then. Are we seeing the initial engagements? Not really. I mean, there's Numenorian cohort which have fallen, so this was a battle that started. And Numenor having to reset, Mordor looking still pretty comfortable over here. How do Numenor approach this? This is the problem with having a very high quality army. As much as their merits are very clear on the defence, where your goal is to make the battlefield a little bit smaller, the enemy have to come to you. In this situation, even though individually Numenor's army will not be scared of these standard Uruks at all, their numbers combined with the range support the Mordor have in place, the efficiency of that engagement just isn't there for Numenor, and it's a similar sort of problem to the likes of Imladris have when they're on the attack. They can be very useful, but maybe not in the traditional sense that an attacker can be, and I think they are actually waiting on their allies to make a little bit of progress, so Mordor will have to siphon off some of their resources to help them. That's a dangerous game to play, because ultimately if Numenor's allies don't make any progress, which so far they haven't, could end up being that Numenor have to end up fighting more units rather than less, and of course that's basically a death sentence. Dol Amroth Spearmen did move forward. Rhune's front line looking a little bit more thin on the ground now, Belfalas Marines perhaps, and the Parathor Horse Archers in the background managing to find their mark a little bit more so, but again still don't have that attacking edge. The Parathor champions earlier dealt with by the javelins from on high, speaking of which, now being committed to melee just to ensure not only do they have the damage type advantage but also the numbers advantage on this front line, keeping Dol Amroth very much in check. Victory seems that only a fool could lose this battle. At the back, Dol Amroth halberdiers now moving forward, taking some fairly hefty damage on the approach as well. Shadow bows with a few hits. I mean, they could do with more Gamprim on this front line as a result, because as it stands, Dol Amroth do now have the phalanx advantage. Something they wouldn't have expected to have too often in this battle, I don't think, at the very least an even fight. Still have plenty in reserve, of course. All of the attackers do still have the ability to go again should the need arise, but that will only last for so long. It'll be interesting to see if the defenders can keep this sort of pace up throughout the entire battle as well. Victory. A distinct possibility for Gondor now, committing forward more units, Pelargia Marines on the front line. Khand offering a little bit of support with some Nurads here, but the pikes so far having a positive influence, although they are very nearly all dead now. More spears being added to the front line to soothe that need. Many phalanx units left from Rhun either though, plenty of casualties being inflicted from both sides. I assume I will be feeling a little bit better about this now. Rhun don't really have reinforcements too close to hand. Maybe the crossbows, but the domino effect could start to come into play if Dabo isn't careful there. If that front line falls, he doesn't have the ability to reorganise himself too quickly. Meanwhile, interestingly, these Khandish forces had a counterattack into Tommy's position. Many of them left, of course. Khand ready to reset. A huge pile of corpses, as we've said. This has probably been the most violent of all the fights on the field so far. Tommy's army still has a little bit more to give as well, though of all the attackers you would say that he's probably got the least left in him. Having to fight two of the defenders at once, however. Meanwhile, Dabo having to fight two of the attackers at once, so it swings and roundabouts. So far I think the defenders have had the better of that engagement, but that may very well change around if one of the attackers does start to make some genuine progress. Dismounted Serpent Guard proving their merits on the front line as well. Veterans Osculith here as well. Another bridge pathway into the front line, but Tommy not able to take advantage of that, and neither is Numenor with their smaller army. Meanwhile, Mordor moving forwards, taking the fight to Numenor a bit, perhaps in answer to the seafarers of Nindamos trying to use their javelins. Mordor still having a good time of it. Again, Numenor need to commit more numbers to this sort of fight than they are currently doing. Otherwise, I can't see it ending too well for them. Numenorian Shield Guard and Numenorian Cohort together with the Seafarers, but we did notice the Uruk Halberds were in there. Fodder damaged, not vanquished yet. Javelin's going to try and get into place to fire down from on high, and this is part of the problem here. The numbers on the front line, Numenor could commit forward more to deal with this sort of thing, but the Orc Javelin's able to get easy value. And when one unit is out, the other unit will move forwards. Ardenheim, Shadow Bows and Temple Guard still doing their thing. They are depleted at this point, so Numenor have been doing a fairly decent job pushing back on Mordor's archers, but undoubtedly Mordor's archers will have done enough damage to the point where their infantry is looking a little bit more comfortable, and there's still a whole nother wave of Uruks that Numenor are going to have to try and find the strength to try and deal with. Uruk Halberd is going to prove to be a very important unit, the bedrock really of Mordor's defence. And the pikes. Fresh unit of Balagai pikemen, maybe that can help things, considering Mordor will have an ever decreasing amount of ammunition to work with. Gondor spearmen and Gondor infantry now moving forwards as well. Nomadic Axemen, the balance of forces is evenly matched. Gondor's beyond this position. Is this the moment? I briefly mentioned the domino effect earlier in this battle, but Gondor, I think they do notice that now is going to be the time. Nimlothian Honor Guard moving forward, a lot of strength now being marshalled by Her-Tumahai to try and make this work. Gondor archers also acting in support, E-strong crossbows firing, trying to hit the units that managed to slip in behind in the back, but this is often where the defenders can start to come unstuck a little bit. Plenty of quality from the front, any sort of pressure from the rear as well is going to make those melee defense values tumble. Chieftain's Vanguard also getting into position to try and do the same. Nomadic Marauders now having to flee, but the Chieftain's Vanguard already, this fight is now becoming a little bit more congested. And with the Mumakil advancing down the street, the defenders' answer to this Gondorian challenge is fairly obvious. With stuff like Nomadic Marauders and Nomadic Axemen being a pretty heavy part of this front line at this point, though, I don't know if it's going to be enough for the defenders to actually start to turn this particular fight around. I mean, the Mumakil could use their ranged units first. Gondor Spearmen still a little bit fractured. It's dangerous for something like the Chieftain's Vanguard to be charging in like that, but when they are this scattered, perhaps it is the answer. Meanwhile, Dol Amroth, that was a pretty quick turnaround here. I think perhaps with more reinforcements being committed over to try and stymie Gondor's advance, Dol Amroth have also seen the opportunity here. This is good conjoined efforts from the attackers, and after a fairly tough opening for them, this is their opportunity to start making some real headway here. They can start to claim real territory within the settlement and start to push the defenders around a little bit off of their initial very comfortable perch. Carmel Shadowbows in behind. They don't really have any infantry back there either, and this is maybe a case of overcommitment to the initial defensive positions by the defenders, and this is going to become Mordor and Harad's problem pretty quickly, as Rhun in particular, but also Can, start to falter. Parathal Horse Archers moving through now as well. Where are they going to set up? Mordor committing more units over here. Gondor renewing their assault once more, which this is important even if Tommy doesn't necessarily break through in the same way that his allies do. Forcing more resources over to try and stop his advance also means there's going to be less marshalling this position as well. Southern Pikemen moving over here to try and stop any further advances across the bridge, although I don't think that's going to be likely now. I mean, there are Vanguard of King Elisar over here, which are scary, but they are pretty heavily stopped here. Meanwhile, Beast Hunters here, different melee weapon for them these days. Also, that one unit of Veterans of Osgiliath did end up crossing this bridge in the end, so a three-pronged assault, though some of the prongs are a little bit sharper than others. And then, over here, still Mordor with a vast cluster of standard Uruks, and well, there goes the Runic General at the hands of the Haven Guard. Steel Bows, there's not a huge amount of reinforcements either. The Pharazim Swordmasters, the Narun Aru, so some good units, but if they continue to get bullied at range by halberds and javelins and rangers, I think Numenor are going to be a bit of a footnote in this engagement ultimately. Still Trollmen to be committed as well, always a scary unit to have in the back pocket. And we did see the Fountain Guard move in, but we're seeing also poison projectiles be utilised. I don't know how much more punishment this Gondor army can take either, so it may end up being a split of 2-2 victories, the margins of which will become the more important thing. The Mumakil still rampaging around the field, lots of these Parathal Horse Archers dead. Gondor infantry taking hits from the archers, who are atop the mighty beasts. But here, I mean, it's pretty much most of the settlements actually, with the collapse of those initial defensive positions, is now the attackers for the taking. The defenders can't really afford to move themselves off their initial defensive position, so this little island here on that side of the river, ironically enough, is going to be where the defenders have to make their stand. Very-eyed bowmen going after some of the Dol Amroth spearmen on the advance. The shields will help them there. Interesting to see how the Very-eyed bowmen get on in melee. I think they have a big enough numbers advantage to win here now. And they will certainly have a little bit of support from Mordor as well, but this isn't how you would expect it to go perhaps, but maybe the size of the settlement made it so you have to be a little bit more adaptable, especially if you front load your defence as the defenders were doing, and perhaps rightly so, given how fruitful their initial clashes were. You can definitely see why they decided to and go down this route. Defeat seems certain for both sides, weirdly enough, but that certainly won't be the case for Khand. With their Nurad Stormguard up here, they will easily manage to beat back the Gondorians, and with only another standard unit of man-at-arms being the next commitment of reinforcements, they will be able to maintain that as well. We are into the final 10k frames just about now. And we'll go barreling through, so we will see the outcome of this quick turnaround now. Rhun going tit for tat with Dol Amroth now, both slaying one another's generals. So far it has been the attackers, perhaps understandably, that have had more morale issues. The Haven Guard, 53 of them, many of them have moved on, but the general got left behind and stuck on what remains of the runic defensive position. Dabo of the defenders doesn't have much, only a couple of units of Carmel's chosen really, but he did have to face 2 of the attackers, so not the worst return. And the Carmel's shadow bows could still yet be a very integral part of this defence. We've seen the shadow bows from Mordor already be pretty effective. Meanwhile, Gondor really trying to force the issue here, pushing their way through the Uruk infantry. But yeah, understandably, Gondor putting themselves under a lot of strain mentally, and that meant the Mumakil could move in and hammer home their fear. Lords of Anadune. I think I'm pronouncing that wrong. I think I'm going to have to look that up after this, but I think that's pretty much it for Tommy's army. He may have a few units here and there, but outside of that, I mean, he still has a force up there, I suppose. Not an insignificant one either. Nothing's insignificant at this point, given the fraught nature of everything now. When a defensive position does start to buckle, the defenders do have to rapidly reorganise themselves. Chieftain's Vanguard over on that side of the river, which is not great for the attackers. Still looking a little bit stretched. I mean, it's mostly Y2K over here is trying to make something happen in the backfield. I don't think there's any saving Numenor. I think it would be far better to try and do what's right for your forces over here and pick apart the defenders that are here as you see fit without having to rush, but maybe you do have to rush with cavalry presence, with the possibility of shadow bow fire. Maybe you do need to get across this river as quickly as possible, and Dol Amroth did take casualties earlier on, so they certainly don't have a limitless amount of manpower as this fight continues. Variag Bowman, also not quite as scary as the Rangers, but going after Halberdiers, that's a good choice of target. I really don't think the attackers, I mean, it's still up in the air, but I don't think the attackers have got the numbers to be able to sustain these kind of movements. Meanwhile, Numenor still the Pharazim Swordmasters way in the backfield, trying to be saved maybe as a ringer later on to try and deliver one final burst of quality to see the attackers over the line. Maybe it could work, but I think they're leaving it a little late, and also Mordor don't have the most range support over here now, so now I think would be the time for those Pharazim to move over, and that would put Mordor under the cosh, because they have been fighting for a while and they don't have the quality to be able to deal with the Pharazim Swordmasters one-to-one. They would be reliant, as they have been, on their numbers, but it's a different matter when you're facing off against a unit like that. And in Lothian Honour Guard, not many of them left. The Serpent Archers can certainly look after themselves in melee as well, so Harad should be able to clean up what remains of Gondor up here. Trollmen have also been committed. They haven't really been too omnipresent in this battle. Whenever we see Harad, usually it is the Trollmen and the other similar units of their type that are often the centrepiece of what Harad do. This time around it's been a far more functional affair. Dismounted Serpent Guard have maybe been their most important unit. The Mumakil now starting to fall. 2 of them dead, 1 remains. Still can be used as a pretty good cudgel in terms of morale, but the attackers still making some pretty good ground over here, not able to withstand this continued advance so far. The defenders, Rangers of Nimrodel, Still a good amount of Nimnothian Honor Guard. That is a good burst of quality as well, so add that to the Pharazim Swordmasters we know are still alive. Things could be yet pretty difficult for the defenders. Maybe I didn't take into account the level of quality some of these units still possess. Talon Knights, says defeat seems certain. That's going to be a lot of death inflicted by those Mumakil Stomps. When the Mumakil do decide to do those melee attacks, they are really very, very dangerous. Chieftain's Vanguard coming in with a charge from the rear as well, trying to pick apart these high quality units. The armor piercing not going to be really that useful against the Shadow Bows, but the sheer advantage in terms of melee prowess the Talon Knights have will do most of the work anyway. Haven Guard is still very bloodied from their excursions, but still very much alive as well. And it's actually it's far closer than I was giving it credit for earlier. Lords of Anadune also getting involved. Cavalry making a nuisance of itself, the Chieftain's Vanguard not being given a monopoly on that. And again, they've been active for quite a while at this point, the Lords being one of the first units we saw in action, used early on and then sparingly up until now, so that's good discipline from T.S. Niehoff. There goes Tommy's General. Don't necessarily think he's going to have too much left to give. Finally, the Pharazim Swordmasters are marching forward. It's a little bit too late in my opinion, because they're not going to be marching forward really in support of anything. Mordor are going to be victorious over here, and they are going to be able to decide what to do with a lot of these units. Basic as they may be, the defenders will have the freedom to move their units around a little bit, which may be exactly what they need, given Dol Amroth and Gondor are making progress elsewhere, and in fact I think this blob of Gondorian quality that Hatumihai has is probably going to be too much for the defenders to deal with now that I look at it. There are still Trollmen and Stormguard up here. It's all well and good, but they're getting shot by Rangers of Nimrodal as well. Well, the tables turn. That has been the preserve of the defenders so far in this battle, but the attackers now making that their own. The Stormguard probably are the best choice of target for those Rangers. Fountain Guard also still alive. 120 of them, that's a lot. Big burst of quality and damage. Maybe these Gondorians have gotten a little bit far ahead of themselves, getting themselves isolated a little bit in behind the Veriag Bowmen, facing off against yet more Trollmen, and another unit of the fairly impressive dismounted Serpent Guard. The full armour upgrades on the veterans of Osgiliath and their locked morale will mean that they have to be killed in their entirety, and that will take some time to do, but maybe this is something the defenders can take advantage of. 4 Chieftain's Vanguard remain. Harad Stormguard peeling themselves off that front line, having been shot up. I mean, the Stormguard are something Gondor will be scared of. Very effective units at what they do. Clash of the Titans between themselves and the Nimlothian Honor Guard. The damage goes to the Stormguard, but positionally and support-wise, the Nimlothians do have the backup to make that work. Tommy's forces pretty much gone. Beast Hunters dealing with some scraps. Serpent Archers moving in too. Heroic Infantry trying to help finish off some of the Haven Guard who have made their way over here, so Mordor moving some of those units away, which will of course give the Pharazim Swordmasters the way into the settlement they want, and they'll easily rip their way through Orc Javelins. But could this be? Numenor have had a pretty torrid time of this battle so far. Their cavalry's been fairly effective, but their infantry has struggled. Is this the moment? Can they use this one unit of supreme quality? There goes the Candish General. More and more it is looking like the attackers may have what it takes. Those big pushes on the other side from Gondor and Dol Amroth really did change the whole complexion of this battle. If they remained too patient, probably wouldn't have been in their best interests. Phantom Guard, victory a distinct possibility. Gondorians consolidating. Over here meanwhile, Fountain Guard fighting evenly with the Trollman. The Trollman going to get surrounded by the veterans of Osgiliath, so as much as this was an even fight, when surrounded, a unit is not going to have the best of times. I mean, I know the Trollman's defensive values are not really their focus anyway, but of course surrounding a unit takes away their melee defense for the most part. Guards of Osgiliath still there. I'm just having a look at the percentages of kills. The defender's still ahead by 2%, but it's those individual examples of quality which may very well end up seeing the attackers through. Pharazim Swordmasters, they are getting hit now by Temple Guard and Ardenai of Shadowbows, a constant thorn in Numenor's side, and still that is proving to be the case. Defeat a distinct possibility in melee, but Eastron Crossbow is still alive as well, so they recognise really what a threat the Pharazim Swordmasters are. Trying to deal with them with what resources they have left, and they are taking damage, but still 55 of them. I'd be impressed if any of the kills on them are going to be inflicted by these Uruk infantry, who are shaken. Let's not forgetting those percentages as well. Routing units are something of a grey area, and many of the defending units have taken to routing as the battle has gone on, whereas initially that was an exclusive non-privilege of the attackers. Yeah, those Trollmen very, very quickly starting to melt away now. The damage of the Fountain Guard, the position of the veterans of Osgiliath. Unsurprising that this is the way things have gone. And elsewhere, Stormguard fighting well actually, despite the loss of the general earlier. The presence of the Dol Amroth Halberdier is certainly helping matters for the attackers, giving them that phalanx. And the Lothian Honour Guard's numbers still in their favour as well. Veterans of Osgiliath defeat seems certain, but as again, they're a really good defensive brick to have in the front line. Serpent Archers and what remains of Harad trying to deal with them, but it is still close, this. I think with these extra reinforcements from the Gondorians, they're certainly not going to have any range support left after trying to deal with all of the Pharazim Swordmasters, which they are chipping away at, but I don't think they'll be able to kill them off in their entirety either. And so I think in terms of sheer martial might, the attackers have it at this stage. Some of the Pharazim Swordmasters also up here now dealing with the Temple Guard. Temple Guard far more of a worthy foe in melee, or at least they would had they not already been heavily depleted. Atuma High's General. Is a morale shock completely off the table? Maybe not, but I think with how favourable their position is, you'd be doing very well as the defenders if you were able to engender such panic at this late stage. Fountain Guard, also veterans of Osgiliath and Halberds, still a few flag rim. The Carmel's chosen. I mean, I don't know if Davo's been waiting for an opportunity to recommit these guys, but it's probably too late to do that at this point. Probably should have been done earlier. Even if it was a bit of a Hail Mary, it would have been better than waiting until this moment, because this joint Gondor Dol Amroth axis once again seems to have claimed a noticeable amount of momentum. And with that, excuse me, with that I think that's going to be the one. Allies scattering like scared geese. Who would that be? Is that Mordor? No. I suppose it must be canned. Still a few runic, Harad and Mordor units fighting throughout the field. Not much left though, is there? The Lothians still alive. Southron Pikemen still alive late on into the game. There goes the Mordor general. I think that is the final general on the field. probably will be the final hurrah for Mordor as well. Oh no, that was the final general, Harad's. So there we have it. Very much a case of clean up now in the final 1,000 frames. And yes indeed. It's only very late on actually that the attackers have gained the percentage advantage, with a 1 now flicking over, but as I said, the routing units kind of throw a spanner in those works anyway. But it's going to be what looks to be a 3% difference in the end, which seems about right given this is pretty much the entirety of what the attackers have left, plus what remains of those Pharazim Swordmasters, which, while very high quality, is still a pretty small proportion of the initial army. And that is that for them. So what remains? Still a fight going on over here. I suppose Rhun may very well be the last one standing. Players now admitting defeat. That was Harad going next. I don't think the Trollman might be locked morale. Something I haven't really actively considered before. But that is surely that. Still fighting going on. What's going on? Is there like one Carmel's Chosen still remaining in the middle of this mosh pit? Nah, celebrations erupting across the field now. And that is that. And this followed pretty much a very simple path, this battle, didn't it? It was initially the defensive positions were doing pretty well and doing, you know, good, efficient work, but when Dol Amroth and Gondor decided the time was right, and they timed that very well actually, Tumahai and Y2K, their push forward against Dabo, who was guarding those front lines on his own, let's not forget, was good, and that was maybe where things fell down. Tommy suffered the same fate as an attacker, but it's more likely as an attacker that you can be that fall guy. Tommy actually got the most amount of kills for his trouble in fighting against those odds that he was faced with. But ultimately, he was not able to make the territorial inroads that any of his allies ultimately were able to, because he was having to fight more than one defender. But you can get away with that more as the attackers. As the defenders, if you leave one player to really do the vast majority of the work against more than one attacker, it's going to be very difficult. I mean, if you have a very favourable defensive position, it can work. But Dabo had 2 choke points to look after, and I think more support over there was probably required. And I have to say, I think as much as Mordor were very comfortable for Numenor very comfortable against Numenor for the vast majority of the battle, it was only really late on when other things started to go wrong and they had to siphon off units that Numenor were able to make some inroads. Maybe Mordor should have been less tunnel vision for that one defensive position. Maybe should have sent over some support for Rhun, because numbers were ultimately the thing which allowed Gondor to start steeping around the sides and Dol Amroth to start battering through them from the front. Maybe just a few units of Uruk infantry wouldn't have gone amiss. I don't think it would have made a great deal of difference to how that fight would have gone against Numenor anyway, given how much more Mordor had in the tank numbers-wise, nearly 1,500 more units. Surely you could have spared maybe 2-3 units of Uruks at least to give Rhun a little bit of support, maybe a little bit of extra help as well from Cand. Maybe organisationally that was where the defenders went wrong, and ultimately in the end it was to the attackers' benefit. But when the moment came, you can't argue with the fact that the attackers took full advantage of that. Let's see what did the damage for Rhun at any rate. Carmel's Chosen were present for quite a while in the battle, 148 kills for a more defensive unit. Infantry is not bad, especially when you consider some of them were Haven Guard, Loke Flag Rim, some of them doing well, some of them maybe underperforming a little bit given the opponents they were going up against. Gamprim as well, maybe you could say a little bit more was needed from them. Balkoth Tribesmen did well, Shadow Bows as well, also doing pretty well for themselves. Eastron Crossbows, as often they do, did well. Only 5 on that Gamprim, but 204 on the other one, so mixed performances there. And the Immortals, you never expect them to get huge amounts of kills. Maybe you expect them to perform a little bit better in melee than the Eastron Clansmen, but I think in this case It was always going to be a bit of a weird one, given the fact that they were going to be the first line, but it also put them a little bit at risk from the enemy ranged units. But yeah, an interesting fight on another new map, which is always good to see more people getting involved in the creation of these sorts of battles. I have been given more, of course. Like I said, this is the first replay that I've been given, or that I'm going to be recording since getting back from a trip away for work. And actually, interestingly enough, this is one of the very rare occasions where I'm recording this on the same Saturday that it's actually going to be released on. So that's a real rarity these days. But I do have a few more in my backlog now, which I will be doing in this particular stint where I'm still at home. So we'll be getting through those, including a midweek battle, which probably won't be this Wednesday because I want to use tomorrow to record another full-scale battle like this one, which will be out next week. But following on from that, we'll have a 1v1 pitch battle on the grassy plains, which by all accounts was very, very close on this version of the game as well. We will also be seeing a few more. There has been an update, so I'm going to be trying to get through all of the replays that will run on this very specific version of the test build first, and then move on to the ones later. So maybe that patch has fixed standard siege battles, I don't know, so we might start to see a few more of those. We'll see, we'll see. But anyway, big thank you to Dabo, who I believe made this map and hosted the game, of course, so big thank you to him for doing all of that and for sending me the battle replay. Big thank you to all of the usual suspects as well, which were a part of this lobby, for making this replay what it was. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.